Good afternoon. Glad to see some faces here. I just wanted to introduce myself. My name is Suzanne Thomas. I'm currently the director of the honors program here at Rose State. And we have put together a series of lectures called The Philosophy of BS. So I'm glad you guys made it. Our first lecture, of course, is today by Dr. Crain, who is head of the philosophy department here at Rose State. Our next lecture will be March 3rd with Dr. Adjoa Hadar, and her title is If You Can't Dazzle with Science, Baffle with BS. March 30th. I got a on that one. March 31st, Professor Darcy Delaney Nelson. Hers is There's No News Like Fake News. And last is Dr. Sherry Jewel Fleming, The Psychology Behind Propaganda, and that will be April 28th. They're all going to be at this time at 2 p.m., hopefully in this room, and we're real excited. I also wanted to let you know that if you enjoyed this very much, we will be offering this as a collaborative teaching class over this same topic. It will be a liberal arts elective called Philosophy of BS, and that will be in the fall of 2022, and it will be offered with an embedded honors component to it. So hopefully, if you enjoyed this, you're definitely going to enjoy our other professors and extended time as well. So without any further ado, I'm going to turn it over to Dr. Crain, and he's going to tell us what BS is. Thank you.
All right, I want to start with a couple of interesting examples that what's going on here. The first video I want to show you is, I remembered. The first video that I want to show you is a clip from the sitcom 30 Rock, and what you're about to see is that it takes place during the 2012 election, and the head of NBC, who's played by Alec Baldwin, as well as the head writer on this comedy show, played by Tina Fey, they have both found out that, fiction, of course, that the election will hinge on the votes in the panhandle of Florida. And it turns out that their head actress on the show is wildly popular in the panhandle of Florida, and so they're trying to convince her to tell her fans who to vote for, and so they hold a mock presidential debate. What I want to show you is the last speech, the closing statement of the character Jack Donaghy, Alec Baldwin, the speech that he makes to try to convince the actress, Jenna, to tell her fans to vote for Mitt Romney. Here it is. What did you do to me? Am I back? Okay. From current slide. It said resume slideshow somewhere. Now I got it. Okay, ready? Here you go. So here is that first video.
Mr. Donaghy, your closing statements?
When our founding fathers first set out, time and time again, our nation horizon, prosperity, dreams, freedom. But the spirit, journey, destiny. Mitt Romney values, Jenna values. I've met people for this generation and generations to come. Thank you, America.
There you go, that's it. So this is really odd. I'm going to show you one more, and then it's very similar in flavor. This is a clip from the comedy show called Community, and what you're about to hear is the main character, Jeff Winger, decide he wants to give a speech for why people at Greendale Community College should elect him student president.
Jeff Winger! My name is Jeff. I'm no politician. I'm just a fella. I think that beer should be cold and boots should be dusty. I think 9/11 was bad. And freedom? Well, I think that's just a little bit better.
Okay, both of these are really odd pieces of speech. So look, there you go for the text. When our founding fathers first set out time and time again, our nation, horizon, prosperity, dreams, freedom. That's not even a coherent sentence. But it had this impression on Jenna. He's not lying. He's not even said enough to have told a lie. But is he telling the truth? It's not clear what he's communicating. And in the case of Jeff Winger, my name is Jeff. I'm no politician. I'm just a fella. I think beer should be cold and boots should be dusty. 9/11 was bad. Freedom, that's a little bit better. This is a speech for why he should be elected president. And again, I mean, I don't know that any of that is a lie. Maybe he genuinely thinks beer should be cold and boots should be dusty. But it's not really informing me of anything either. I mean, it's true, but it doesn't seem like I'm getting anything in particular. I'm suggesting to you, these might be two good examples of what philosophers have come to call BS. The philosopher Harry Frankfurt wrote an essay in 1986 called On Bullshit. And he really did try to analyze, like, what is this kind of speech that we encounter in the wild that people engage in? Because it really does not seem like the kind of thing we tend to call lying or even deception exactly. It seems like people are engaged in something else altogether. So what's fascinating is that that work by Frankfurt was published as a book in 2005. Here is what's hilarious, because I say, like, oh, then he turned it into a book. He added absolutely
A couple of years ago, maybe a year and a half or 2 years ago, I started editing a series of philosophy books for the Princeton University Press called Princeton Monographs in Philosophy. And the editor at the press with whom I worked was a man named Ian Malcolm. And one day when I was talking to Ian, he said, you know, I've been thinking about your essay on bullshit, which seems to have attracted quite an enthusiastic following, though it's only on the internet and in this rather obscure journal. Why don't we bring it out as a little book? I said, how can it be a book? It's only about 25 pages long. He said, well, we can do a lot with margins and typefaces and page sizes, and that's what they did. They brought out this little book. It's not even 70 pages long.
So even book publishers are well aware of student tricks. Oh, I don't have enough pages yet, so let's try a little triple space action. Let's get that 12 font. Come on now, let's be kind to the teacher. Let's get it there in the 16 range. And yeah, if you look at this thing, it's really tiny. But I'd like to tell you really quickly kind of the contents of that, and then the backlash for why philosophers thought he didn't really get things right. He says, look, we have all these terms that we use, but it seems like BS is the most popular. But we have other words in the English language. Most of them, when I look at, sound very British English to my ears. But it seems like we have words that we're trying to use to identify like what exactly this speech is. His big takeaway is that he thinks that when people engage in this activity, they just aren't doing the same thing as lying. It's just different than lying. A lie is designed to insert a particular falsehood at a specific point in a set of systems of beliefs. This requires a degree of craftsmanship. The liar is inescapably concerned with truth values. In order to invent a lie at all, he must think he knows what's true. And in order to invent an effective lie, he must design his falsehood under the guidance of that truth. So, for example, we can probably all think back to our childhoods about like the first time we tried to lie our way out of troubles with our parents. And in order to have told a lie at all, you have to have some sense that you know how things actually went down, and then you're going to have to say, not that. But don't just stop there. You realize that's not enough. It's, in that regard, extremely easy to lie. But there's this other concern, and that's like, but you need to like be good at it. Well, then you can't just say something you take to be false. There's lots of things you take to be false. that are not going to be persuadable to anybody. So there was this fantastic viral video, 4 or 5 years ago, and this mom is running her phone. She's already started the camera, and she's walking into the bathroom. She opens the door, and there's a kid, could not be more than 4 years old. There's no way. There is baby powder everywhere. I mean, on the walls, on the sink, on the toilet, all over himself. And I don't remember what his name was. Let's just say, I don't know, Timmy. Timmy, what's going on here? And he clearly, you know, like the face of someone who has been caught. This is so great because what happened here? And like the kid's just dumbfounded, no answer. And they're, who did all this? Pause, pause, pause. Spider-Man. And what really sealed the deal is that, I mean, and she like really put, Spider-Man? Spider-Man is the one that did all this? Oh yeah, Spider-Man. And what's awesome is in the clip, in the video, you can see right behind him, not only was there baby powder on the wall, but he had literally written with his finger, Timmy. And she goes, really? Spider-Man went over there and wrote your name on the wall? Yeah. He was in it to win it. He was not going to give up. Well, the whole point of that, right, is that those early ages when we're telling lies, we get the concept that it has to be something that we take to be false. We don't get this other concept, and that is that like we have to be so concerned with how things actually went down that we need to end up saying something that really does sort of fit the square peg in the system of somebody else's beliefs. There's a case where she might have had a square peg, maybe, a square peg that he could have filled in, but he showed up with something shaped like Spider-Man instead of a square peg, and it didn't fit. Right. Notice the point here, though, for Frankfurt is that liars, as bad as that is for us in terms of having true beliefs and avoiding false beliefs, we don't want liars in our lives. That's true. But think about how the liar really has to care about what the truth is in order to, A, lie at all, and B, try to be good at it. So he says that's really not what seems to be happening in the case of people who are BSers. It seems more like this old-timey expression we don't use a whole lot anymore, but we say things like, you might have heard people say things like, that guy's full of hot air. And the idea is when people start speaking, sometimes it seems like it doesn't really matter if you just said those words or just exhaled in my face. There doesn't seem like there's any substance there. And he says this seems why we like to use this word, BS, to refer to this kind of communication because, and I'm sorry, there's like people eating in here, but like if you think very literally about BS, we're talking about biologically stuff that a body has already extracted everything useful from. There's nothing good or worthwhile left in it. That seems to be what we mean when we use this term BS. Lying conceals or misrepresents the facts, or at least what the liar takes to be the facts. But BSing conceals or misrepresents the fact that the BSer doesn't care whether or not the BSer is getting things right. The BSer is fundamentally identified as a person who really doesn't care what the truth is. That's not the point. It's faking things. I'm trying to convince you that I do care about getting things right if I'm BSing you, according to Frankfurt. The BSer doesn't care whether the BS is true or false. Hey, if it's true, all the better for me trying to persuade you into something. Only that the hearer believe the BSer to be concerned with the truth when really not concerned with the truth. Well, is he right or wrong?
Wrong.
Well, this philosopher, Gerald Cohen, wrote a piece called Deeper into Bullshit, and he thinks that Frankfurt's account is okay as far as it goes, but it only identifies part of what we care about. There's definitely more BS than just the Frankfurt kind. Notice in the case of Frankfurt's BS, the focus is, well, I had a lot of fun making this slide. The focus is too much on the person engaging in the activity. And it doesn't seem like Frankfurt gets that sometimes what we really care about is just the content of what somebody said. Sometimes content is just terrible content. It's BS. So there you go. You focuses too much on the bull and not enough on the poo. Well, this is the one I came up with. Focuses too much on the moo, not enough on the poo. You're welcome. You're welcome. Okay. Can't even pay for comedy that good. I mean, literally. Okay. What interests me, Cohen here, what interests me is a certain variety of nonsense, namely that which is found in discourse that is by nature unclarifiable. Not only is it obscure, but it can be unobscured. Any attempt to clarify creates something that isn't recognizable as a version of the original. So he gives 3 different categories of what he has in mind here, but notice that the similarity between all 3 is that the focus is on the content of what is being said. He's not going to make any reference whatsoever to the intention of the person who says it. It may very well be the case that this person really is concerned with getting things correct. That doesn't matter. If we encounter this content, it seems like this is also an instance of this thing that we're worried about, BS. So he mentions unclarifiable unclarity. So as an example of this, I wanted to tell you about a more recent development in this work. Social science has recently taken up the cause of trying to do empirical research into BS in our world. This really started in 2015 with this paper right here on the reception and detection of pseudo-profound bullshit by a team of psychologists. What they decided to do was, could we come up with a metric based on this work by Frankfurt? Can we come up with some tool to see whether some people are more receptive to BS than others? And so here's how they did it. They used an algorithm that has been designed to process the Twitter feed of a guy named Deepak Chopra. Deepak Chopra is a medical doctor, but he is a prolific author in the New Age movement. And so what this algorithm does is it takes words and phrases from the Twitter feed of Deepak Chopra, and it just randomly generates syntactically correct sentences using those words. And in fact, if you want to use it, you can go to the wisdomofchopra.com, and it will give you your own handy Wisdom of Chopra quotes. Things like, the human nervous system expresses exponential timelessness. What? What? Okay, so what they do is they generate a bunch of these, and then they give people a list of 10 items, and then they also give them a list of profound statements that seem legitimately profound. So old sayings, a river cuts through a rock not because of strength, but because of persistence, And the idea is they ask people to rate the profundity of each of these statements. And so the idea is the higher they rate the statements that were generated randomly, i.e. with no concern for the truth whatsoever, it seems like that's an indicator that people are more receptive to BS. And the less of a difference there is between the score of rating the Chopra statements versus rating the actual profound adages seems like an indicator that people are not good at detecting the difference between BS and what is in fact profound. He is also, this is Cohen again, so he's also considered, this is his term, rubbish. He is a Brit, by the way. Look, sometimes arguments are just grossly deficient in logic and in sensitivity to empirical evidence. Again, he hasn't said a word about the intention or aim of the person who did it. We're talking about the product. So that's what makes Cohen's concerns so different than Frankfurt's. The issue here is like sometimes, even if somebody tried well, like it's just bad argumentation, not good, and we use this term, that's just BS. Also, he says there's this category, irretrievable speculation, and this one can be the trickiest because we can say things that really do seem like, yeah, what about that? Here's the example he gives. I love this example. Of course, everyone spends much more time thinking about sex now than people did 100 years ago, and he says, like, wait, hold on, just stop and think for a minute about how we have zero clue whether that's true or not. For all I know, Queen Elizabeth was just constant porn stream in her head. She's just always thinking about sex. I don't know that. Compare that to whether or not we said something like, of course everybody spends much more time writing about sex than they did 100 years ago. Oh, well, now I can measure that. We can actually take some samples of writing from then and from now and find out, like, okay, is there more work on sex or not? Okay, he says, here's why he's concerned with this content. In other words, like why, it's not just for fun that philosophers go after each other. He's not just like, gotcha, Frankfurt. But he's concerned specifically about BS of this kind, BS that's content, because he's worried in his own day, he's writing in the early 2000s, he's worried that in his own day there is academic things that are passing for rigorous academic work that are in fact instances of the BS that he has in mind. So he describes what we now call the Socal Affair. Alan Socal was a physicist who played a little trick in the late 90s. Socal also had this concern that it seemed like there were disciplines in the academy, people who really were professors in the university and who like wrote work and wrote each other's work. It didn't seem like the work really was saying anything, that there was anything substantive to all this work that they were producing. So here's what he decided to do. He read one of these journals that seemed to be notorious for this kind of thing. And he read enough to kind of see like the 4 or 5 big names that they all seem to quote, And he read enough to find like a few words and phrases that people seem to use in their work. And he sits down and just writes gibberish, including those terms and phrases and a few quotes from those people. And he even said, like, I don't even know what I just said. And so he throws it together, and then he titles it, Transgressing the Boundaries Toward a Transformative Hermeneutics of Quantum Gravity. Woo! Like, whoa! And he writes it, and he sends it into an academic journal that peer-reviewed it and published it. And of course, as soon as it happens, he says, excuse me, I literally just BS'd an entire article, and you're saying this is rigorous academic work here. And Cohen shares this exact same concern in his own time that this is happening. Okay, so you got these two accounts of BS, but like, so what? Why does it matter? Well, I want to give you some reasons why it's so bad. One, Frankfurt argues, this form of communication seems worse than lying. Now, I'm going to tell you why that seems weird in a second, but stop and hear him out. Look, he's not saying that having a bunch of liars is a good thing. It is bad when people are liars, and if there's habitual liars out there, that is mucking up my ability to get more true beliefs and avoid false beliefs, especially if they're good ones. Okay, but even in a world like that where there's tons of habitual liars, those habitual liars, not only to tell the lie, but to do it well, have to constantly be concerned with the way things actually go down. They have to care about the truth. Whereas we can imagine a world where like there's no habitual liars, but there's lots of BSers. Well, they might say on accident some stuff that's true, but they are habitually not caring about the truth. The idea here is they're not even going to the mental gym at all to try to exercise their muscles about getting things right and getting things right enough to convince people of something that is false. Now, BSers don't have to exercise that muscle. That muscle entirely atrophies, and now we have people that really probably can't tell the difference themselves. That seems worse. Someone who lies and someone who tells the truth are playing on opposite sides of the same game. Each responds to the facts as he understands them, although the response of the one is guided by the authority of the truth, while the response of the other defies that authority. The bullshitter ignores these demands altogether, pays no attention to the authority of the truth, either to respect it or defy it. By virtue of this, bullshit is a greater enemy of the truth than lies are. In other words, here's a case where, like, I don't even have to play the game, I don't even have to acknowledge the rules, and now all of a sudden, like, I'm going to lose those very cognitive faculties that I need, frankly, to get on in the world. Okay, it's also bad because we seem to be way more tolerant of it, Frankfurt argues. So in other words, when people get lied to, they feel betrayed, angry. How dare you do this to me? And yet when, on average at least, so Frankfurt argues, it seems like when we get BS, it's more like just a sense of annoyance, roll your eyes. It doesn't seem like we're as fired up. And for that reason, BS can be more insidious than lying, precisely because the degree of, say, blameworthiness and accountability is much lower. Also, why is it bad? Because Frankfurt says, like, there's a lot of it. It's really fun. It's funny to me. He writes this book in scare quotes, this 25-page essay, and it's only like the last page and a half. He goes through all these examples where he's trying to analyze what he thinks BS is, and then he just comes to like the final 3 paragraphs, and he doesn't even try to demonstrate that there's a lot of BS. He just says, why is there so much? In other words, like, surely you'll spot me, that there's tons of this stuff. And he says, well, yeah, it seems as though you're going to have a lot of it when anybody is required to talk beyond their knowledge. So the example I love to give here is if, say, a student was required to do a reading before class, you know, I assigned a reading and all that, and if you're, I don't do this, I'm just not mean enough, but if you're a professor who really wants to hold their feet to the fire, you just call it somebody at random and say, like, tell us what was in the chapter. Now think about the choices this student has. This student, Smith, let's say, didn't do the reading. What are Smith's choices now? Well, Smith could tell the truth. I didn't do the reading. But let's just say Smith has lots of social anxiety, and the professor is willing to like rake people over the coals in front of everybody. So Smith says, like, oh God, I'm not gonna say that I didn't do the reading. Well, now what are the choices? Lying or BS? Think about how lying is a terrible, terrible choice in that situation. In order to lie, you have to take yourself to know the truth. The person didn't do the reading. So it's not like, I know that chapter so well, I could probably convince somebody what wasn't in it, you know? No, the student has no clue what was in the chapter. So, in other words, like, I mean, you could strike out very easily. You could say like, oh yeah, I learned that robots are easy to make in engineering class. And the professor can be like, there was absolutely nothing about robots in that chapter. That's clearly false. And clearly I know more about what's in the chapter than you do. I care about the truth and take myself to know the truth. Well, then, what is this student going to do? Aha, there's this other option, BS. Well, yeah, the chapter, there was parts that were really hard to understand, especially at the end where it seems like there was some sort of maybe controversy or some definitions. Yeah, I read it twice. I didn't quite say much there. It seems like I did that. But in that moment, if I'm the student, I'm required to talk beyond my knowledge. And if I'm required to talk beyond my knowledge, it seems like BSing is a beautiful option. And he says this is also bad because when you live in a democracy like ours where there's some social pressure, maybe to varying degrees depending on your social circles, when there's some social pressure to have informed opinions about hot issues of the day, you got to think about just how complicated our politics are. If I had a whiteboard here, we could just say like, hey, let's just brainstorm what are some big ticket item issues in the news, in society, in the last 2 months, let's say. Look, I'm hoping you'll spot me. We could easily get up to 20 or 30 different topics that are all hot button issues. And he's saying like, it's just not reasonable to expect me to have extremely well-read opinions about 30 things. And yet, somebody is going to have one of those on the board that is like their axe to grind. What do you think about Darfur? Is that a football player? You know, and you're going to have to admit, like, I don't know anything about that. How dare you're not a good citizen? This is important. Well, yeah, Darfur stuff. Woo, that's a mess, isn't it? Tell me what you think about it, right? The idea is like now we have this pressure to BS as though we have way more knowledge than we actually have. Also, he's worried about ideologies that really just deny that there is such a thing as how things actually go down. He really does have in mind here what he calls anti-realist doctrines or even postmodernist doctrines, that kind of thing. These seem to increase the BS that we have to deal with in a day. And fourthly, it's really bad because in the case of a lie, it's really not too terribly difficult to fix. Somebody tells a lie, they get outed, it gets obvious that what they said was false because here's how things actually went down once you find it out. When somebody BS's, it's really difficult to pull that apart because there's so little substance there that I've got to explain how there's no substance there. I love this. After an Italian programmer, the amount of energy needed to refute bullshit is always an order of magnitude larger than it took to produce. It's real easy to BS. It's really hard to deconstruct it as such, though. Fifth, there is lots of evidence from the social sciences in about the past 40 years that, on average, people employ a variety of shortcuts, biases, quick little heuristics to get at beliefs quickly because I can't think hard about everything. Sometimes I've got to get there quick just because I've got to make a judgment call. And that's fine for the most part. Those shortcuts get me on in life, so they must work more than 50% of the time. But it also means that these kinds of shortcuts leave me vulnerable to kinds of mistakes that I can make. And it's exactly those kinds of mistakes that I can make that a BSer can exploit. I'm not going carefully. I'm not deconstructing. I'm not, trying to live by Brandelini's law. I just did my best, and yet that alone can leave me vulnerable to people taking advantage of me. Well, how so? Let me give you a couple examples that, look, I think they're controversial examples, but we can ask ourselves, like, is it a case of what Frankfurt's talking about? Is it a case of what Cohen's talking about? Whatever it is, it seems like it's in the neighborhood, but it's in the neighborhood of things that actually people find persuasive. So really quick, I want to do a couple of examples. One of them is one of the authors of the Affordable Care Act, after the fact, was interviewed about like, well, why did you write it the way that you did? And Gruber, the econ prof that did this, said, well, this bill was written in a tortured way to make sure that the Congressional Budget Office did not score the mandate as taxes. Lack of transparency is a huge political advantage, and basically, call it stupidity of the American voter or whatever, but basically that was really, really critical to getting this thing to pass. Look at this interesting stuff here, written in a tortured way. Lack of transparency. As long as you don't get what I'm up to here. Is it a lie? Is it BS? I'll leave that up to you. Another interesting case, I think, is when then Senator John Kyle of Arizona was standing on the Senate floor, and the argument concerned funding for Planned Parenthood. And of course, his argument was that, like, he still thinks we're funneling some federal funds into abortions that Planned Parenthood provides. And he ends with this comment, and that's well over 90% of what Planned Parenthood does. Well, after the speech, people immediately said, well, that number's clearly not right. And they reached out and said, like, look, by our current best estimates, it's only about 3% of what Planned Parenthood currently does. CNN reached out to him and said, like, can you comment on why you said this 90% number? His office, I kid you not, came back and said, Senator Kyle's remark, I'm not making this up, was not intended to be a factual statement. What does that mean? What is it if it's not intended to be a factual statement? Look, I picked a couple examples from politics, but there's all other areas of life where we are vulnerable to being BS'd in ways that are just really terrible, cruel. I mean, one example you might think of is what people call grief vampires. There are folks who have lost their loved ones, and they are just desperate to feel some sense of reconnection with somebody that they've lost, and using methods that we can call it cold reading is what the term is. Using cold reading methods, people can really convince others, like, oh yeah, I'm talking to your grandma right now. And some of these people really do make millions of dollars off these people who are hurting. I mean, they are getting BS'd. We can also talk about, like, the guru types who can exploit these kinds of mental shortcuts and BS us into doing amazing things. You might have heard about the recent controversy with Nexium, where this guy convinced even a whole slew of fairly well-working Hollywood actresses into joining what seemed like just a tame, maybe MLM a pyramid kind of thing, but which turned out to be like a crazy sex cult, and they got like brandished with his initials. I mean, it really went really far. Maybe you've seen the Netflix special about Rajneesh here. You should have a visit to Gwyneth Paltrow's line of products. There's some amazing stuff there that she has legally had to stop selling because of the degree to which she was BSing what her products even were. But do you think she was not making money on them? She certainly was, yeah. So not just gurus, but there's also a worry about BS even in the hard sciences. There's two professors at the University of Washington who have taught for a few years now a class for their hard science majors called Calling Bullshit. And they have all these amazing examples how even in our, say, published academic journal kinds of science papers, people fudge in just this way that seems like examples of BS. This is just one example that they point out. Look, if you look at this graph presented in exactly this way, it sure seems like there's this big gap right here between these two. It seems so much farther. But notice that the graph starts at 36, not at 0. If we did the graph at 0 to 42, you'd barely be able to tell the difference between those two. Oh, but if I just make the graph bigger and randos start at 36, there's no principled reason why the graph should start at 36 other than make it look bigger. Well, I'm BSing you. I mean, these numbers aren't inaccurate. This is true BS, you might say. But it's still BS meant to impress in a way that you're not really picking up on. These people want you to think they care about getting it right, but they're not super duper caring about getting it right. And this is why they explain that they turn their whole class into a book, by the way. It's pretty good. And in fact, if you don't even want to get the book, they have an entire website with all of their college lectures published on them where they cover tons of examples. They say, look, we have a civic motivation. It's not a matter of left-wing or right-wing ideology. Both sides of the aisle have proven themselves facile at creating and spreading bullshit. Rather, and at the risk of sounding grandiose, adequate bullshit detection strikes us as essential to the survival of liberal democracy. yes, even in science, we have to worry that there is this stuff that we're encountering. Also, there is some evidence from our social sciences that we are very well equipped to do this to ourselves and to very much convince ourselves with this sort of fudgery. Not lying, but just not quite caring about getting it right while trying to tell ourselves that we do. Okay, well, how bad is it really, and what should we do about it? Well, you should come to the lecture series, the next 3 lectures, number 1, and you should enroll in Humanities 2093 in the fall of 22. So there you go. All right. Thank you. Well, is there any questions you have for me? Go right ahead.
So I have a question, and this kind of overlaps with another area that you have research study in, is what is the interaction or relationship between tribalism and bullshit? As we see tribalism grow greater, do we see growth and willingness of people to engage in?
Yes and no. So there's a couple of great examples of this. So one is that let me start with the no. It turns out that when we are confronted with information, say, that seems disconfirming evidence to beliefs that we have, not just as beliefs, but have incorporated into some group dynamic, we actually get way less BSy and very much more careful. So as soon as we're confronted with tribally unfriendly information, we put the thinking cap on and we're extremely careful and extremely skeptical. In the case of preference-consistent kind of information, stuff that like, oh yeah, I like that. That's when we have evidence that we just don't try very hard in those cases. So I don't remember if I said this in the tribalism presentation, but I'll give you an example. Dan Kahan did a study in, I want to say 2011, and it was called something like Motivated Numeracy. And what he did was he had a bunch of demographic information from people, so he knew their party affiliations, right? And then he gave them a basic math skills test, just like we would here, like a placement test. Okay, after that, he gives them these 2 problems to solve, and the problems are like data sets. So he gives them this square with numbers in it, and he just says, look, scientists did this study with skin cream, and we're trying to tell if it cures rashes or not. Well, here's the raw data. Here, there's X number of participants, and now we've categorized the participants. So here's people who used the cream here, people who didn't use the cream here, here's the people whose rashes got better, here's the people whose rashes got worse, yeah? Okay, but he fudged. There's no such study, he just made this up. What he did was he gave half the folks a chart where it said like rash got better on the left and rash got better on the right, and the other people he flipped. So if everybody just did the math right, half should say it works, half should say it not, right? And he knew from previous work that people tend to take one of 2 shortcuts in judging this information. They either just like, the shortcut is like they don't use all the numbers. They just look at one column or they look at one row. And he deliberately chose numbers that both of those shortcuts would get you the wrong answer. So you couldn't just eyeball it. You were going to have to actually work out the math to get it right. Okay. Turns out, he found out we all suck at math, okay? So Republicans and Democrats both were horrendously bad at numeracy, okay? He gave them a set, this is the beautiful part of it. He gave but the whole point of that skin cream problem was, number 1, to test who really had the skills necessary to get it right, right? He gave them a second problem with an identical setup, identical. But it wasn't about skin cream, it was about gun control. And so the study concerned cities who had enacted bans on concealed carry versus cities that didn't have that ban. And he did the same thing again. He picked numbers where the shortcuts would ruin you, go the wrong way, and he gave half where the columns were this way and half where they were flipped. So again, if everyone just did the math right, half of them would say the concealed carry was a good thing, half would say it was a terrible thing. Here's what's crazy. So let me back up. So you realize there's an eyeball test people can employ. They could just like glance at the numbers and say like, oh, yep, it works. But it would give them the wrong answer, right? Okay. So this is just, it's sad. I tell this story a lot, and it's just, it'll make you want to cry. Okay. So when people were confronted with the eyeball test on the gun control problem that looked unfriendly, Just look. So if I'm a diehard liberal, I want those numbers to say gun control is a good thing. And he found out that when people like me confronted eyeball test friendly numbers, they didn't do the math after that. And if they encountered unfriendly eyeball numbers, they did the math. But what was insane was, and Republicans and liberals were equally likely to make that move. What was insane was that pattern actually increased as people's math skills went up. So in other words, people who had proven on the skin cream problem that they could do the math, as soon as they saw eyeball-friendly numbers on the second study, they didn't do the math. And when they got the math right on the skin cream problem, and then they saw unfriendly numbers, it was like, well, we'll see about that. And then they got out their calculators and actually did it. So the idea here is that their tribal affiliations motivated them to either employ a tool that they really did have in the toolbox, or just shut the toolbox and not worry too hard about it. And yet, in the second case, you might say, the first case, you might say, well, no, it didn't increase BS, because they're like, no, and they got really careful about it. But in the last case, the latter case I just described, it seems like they BS themselves, especially the people who just proved they could do the math. That's kind of scary. And there's a second way that I think that this relates to the tribalism questions. That is that there are cases where we can, this is no different than like sports team stuff too, especially when you're at the sports bar arguing with your buddies about like why your team's the best, is that you can take yourself to be arguing in good faith when you are super not arguing in good faith. And you make, in other words, like, were we not talking about your team, you would definitely not be like, no, here's how you actually determine who was the best player and all like that. And changing standards of evidence, basically, okay? But also, I think there are cases where people are expressing things that really do sound like world descriptive beliefs. The world really is that way. But on further pressure, it's really not. They don't know enough about that topic to know whether that's true or false. But they know saying that is like a rah-rah, this is the team that I'm on. I think that's where you get instances of this kind of thing. I'm saying it, and I'm probably convinced that I care about the truth, but it's pretty obvious that I'm not. I'm doing something else. Instead of saying, like, I think gun control is a good thing, I might have said it like that. And in fact, I might say something really elaborate, like there should be this exact kind of ban, this exact kind of background check. I might say a lot of stuff. But ultimately, really all I've said is, I'm team gun control. And I think that's where you get the instance of tribalism encouraging people to BS one another and themselves. Yeah. Any other questions? All right. Well, thank you very much. Oh, wait. Follow up?
Well, not really a follow-up. I'm curious as to who do you find as being most susceptible to BS? I mean, can we break this down demographically, or age groups that are more?
No, I can't do that. So the Pennycook study that I showed you on the receptivity, there's been a lot of work in the past 6 years. What we can say is things like that this susceptibility, I mean, I don't think it gets at what you really want to know, but this susceptibility correlates so in other words, that scale that I actually described, okay? People who score highly on that pseudo-profound BS receptivity scale also tend to score high on metrics used to find fake news susceptibility scales, also tend to score high on conspiratorial thinking. We're still at the cutting edge of like, well, is there an age range, or is there, there have been attempts to get at demographic info, but it does not replicate well across places. And so some people want to say like, aha, we found it out. It's these type of people who are this income bracket or this party, and those particularly don't seem to replicate well. Yep. Oh, and I forgot, the other thing that they had in that study is high correlations with people who tend to see, they're just showed like random dots on a page. People who tend to see patterns in randomized objects, that also correlates highly with BS receptivity. Yep. Did that generate another question or two? Okay, now we're really over then. All right. Thank you guys for coming out.